September 11, 1940. RAF Biggin Hill, Kent, England. 5:47 a.m. The airfield smelled like aviation fuel and wet grass and the specific combination of oil and metal that accumulated in the maintenance hangars over months of continuous operation, and that had become, for the men stationed at Biggin Hill, as familiar and as unremarkable as the smell of their own quarters. The grass on the perimeter was heavy, with the dew that came off the North Downs in the early morning of September, a dew that the sun would burn off by 9, but that, at 10 minutes to 6, gave the airfield the specific quality of a place that has not yet decided what kind of day it is going to be, still carrying the possibility of the night alongside the beginning of the morning. Flight Lieutenant James Carver was 24 years old and had been flying Spitfires for 11 months. He was from a village in Shropshire called Clun, in the hills near the Welsh border, where his father kept sheep on land that had been in the family since before anyone currently alive could trace it, land that in September looked a particular way that James had been thinking about more often than he would have expected, since the summer had shifted into the rhythm of daily scrambles, and the rhythm had become the thing that the days were made of, rather than something imposed on the days from outside. He was not tall, which was useful in a Spitfire cockpit, and had the specific leanness of a man who has been doing physical work since childhood and has never accumulated anything the work did not require. His hands were the hands of a pilot, which is to say they were the hands of a man for whom a specific set of controls had become an extension of the body rather than an instrument operated by the body, the distinction being felt rather than described. He had flown 23 operational sorties since the beginning of August. Of the pilots who had been at Biggin Hill when he arrived in the spring, 8 were no longer at Biggin Hill, 3 had been posted to other squadrons. The other 5 were accounted for in ways that the Daily Operations Board recorded with the specific neutrality of a document that converts irreversible events into administrative facts, the neutrality being not indifference, but the specific form of acknowledgement that the situation required, which was the acknowledgement that permitted the operation to continue. His squadron was 92 Squadron, one of the squadrons that the battle had been grinding through since July, with the specific logic of a process that consumes the things it requires to continue. The pilots came from everywhere that pilots in 1940 came from, which included places that the pre-war RAF would not have anticipated as sources, Poles and Czechs, and New Zealanders and South Africans alongside the English and Scottish and Welsh, men who had arrived at Biggin Hill from different directions and for different reasons, and who had become, through the specific chemistry of shared danger and shared purpose, and the months of the same airfield, something that the different directions and different reasons had not predicted. His closest friend in the squadron was a man named Tomasz Wierzbicki, a Polish pilot who had escaped from Poland in September of 1939 and made his way through Romania and France to England and had been flying with 92 Squadron since June. Wierzbicki was 26 years old and had been a pilot in the Polish Air Force before the invasion and flew with the specific quality of a man for whom flying was not something he had chosen to be good at, but something he had been made to be good at, by the combination of aptitude and circumstance, and the years of a country that understood it would need its pilots to be very good. He spoke English with an accent that the other pilots had stopped noticing in the way you stop noticing the particular quality of a person's voice when the voice becomes familiar. And he had a habit of describing complex situations in very few words that James had come to understand was not economy of language but precision, the difference being that economy leaves things out and precision includes everything that matters and excludes everything that does not. They had been scrambled 9 times in the previous 14 days. 9 times the operations telephone had rung, and the controller's voice had come through with the specific tone of a voice delivering information that requires immediate action, the tone that the pilots had learned to hear in their sleep because their sleep had been calibrated to it. And the 9 scrambles had produced the 9 specific experiences of climbing into a Spitfire and getting airborne and moving toward the thing that the controller's voice had described in coordinates and altitudes and numbers of bandits. The word bandits being the word that the language of the battle had developed for the aircraft that were coming from across the channel, in the formations that the radar at the chain home stations picked up over France, and that the controllers at the sector operations rooms converted into the vectors that the pilots flew to intercept. James ate breakfast at 6:15 in the mess with Wiersbicky and a pilot named Davies from Cardiff, who had joined the squadron 3 weeks ago, and who was still in the process of becoming what the squadron required him to be. The process being not something that could be accelerated beyond what the days themselves accelerated it to, each day adding something that could not be added any other way. Davies ate with the appetite of a young man who has not yet learned to eat carefully before flying, which was something the older pilots had learned, that the body managed better at altitude when it had been given a reasonable quantity of food rather than the maximum quantity the morning appetite suggested. James said nothing about this to Davies, because the saying would not have been as instructive as the learning would be. The scramble came at 8:23. The operations telephone rang, and the controller's voice delivered the information in the standard format, which was the format that the standard format was for. Angels 15, Vector 120, Bandits many, south of the Thames. Angels 15 meant 15,000 feet. Vector 120 meant the heading. Bandits many was the controller's translation of what the radar had shown and what the observer corps had confirmed, which was a formation of German aircraft crossing the coast in numbers that the word many was the available word for. James was in the cockpit at 8:27. The Merlin engine turned over with the sound that the Merlin made when it caught, a sound that was not quite a sound, but was something felt through the airframe as much as heard, a specific vibration that carried through the seat and the controls, and that James had spent 11 months learning to read, the way you learn to read the condition of a living thing through the quality of its response to the things you ask of it. The engine was good. He taxied to the takeoff position and looked at the airfield in the September morning, and at the sky above it, which was the specific blue of English September, at low altitude, a blue that had nothing of the blue of altitude in it, a different blue entirely. 12 aircraft from 92 Squadron became airborne in 4 minutes. The formation climbed south-southeast toward the coast at the rate that a Spitfire climbs when it is being asked to climb as fast as it can climb, which was the rate the situation required and which produced in James the specific physical state of rapid climb, the pressure in the ears and the changing quality of the air, and the altimeter unwinding upward, and the ground falling away in the way that the ground fell away when the ground was Kent in September, seen from a Spitfire climbing at full power, the fields and the roads and the villages becoming the shapes that they became at altitude, the shapes that the maps had been made from. At 12,000 feet, the sky changed from the blue of low altitude to the blue of altitude, which was darker and had a quality of clarity that the lower blue did not have, a clarity that made the distances seem both greater and more precise, the horizon sharper and further, and the space between the aircraft and the horizon more specifically itself than it was at lower altitude. James scanned the sky in the pattern that the pattern was for, the continuous sweep that covered the sectors, and that the 11 months had made into something that happened alongside the other things, rather than instead of them, the scan and the instrument check and the formation position, all running simultaneously, in the way that things run simultaneously, when they have been practiced to the point where the practice has become capacity. Wierzbicky's voice came through the radio at 8:41. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. The specific tone of Wierzbicky's voice on the radio was one of the things that James had learned to read in the same way he read the engine through the airframe. The information in the tone as much as in the words. The tone said, "I see them, and the seeing is accurate, and the number is significant." James looked at 11 o'clock high and saw them. The formation was above and to the left, the shapes of Heinkel 100s and 11s in the grouping that the formations used, the grouping that the Luftwaffe had developed for crossing the channel, in numbers that the numbers were developed for, which was numbers that made the crossing possible and the defense difficult. Above the Heinkels, and slightly behind them, were the shapes of the escort, Bf-109s, at higher altitude, positioned to respond to the RAF squadrons that the Luftwaffe had learned would come. Squadron Leader Mitchell's voice came through with the attack instructions. Blue section would go for the bombers. Red section and yellow section would deal with the escort. The instruction was the instruction that the situation called for, and that the pilots implemented with the specific coordination of men who have practiced the coordination enough times that implementing it does not require the full attention that learning it required, leaving the attention available for the things that the implementation reveals, rather than the implementation itself. James was in blue section. He rolled the Spitfire into the attack heading and pushed the throttle forward, and the aircraft accelerated in the specific way of a Spitfire accelerating from cruise to attack speed. The acceleration that pressed him back into the seat with the weight of a thing that has been waiting to go fast and is now going fast. And the Heinkel formation grew in the gun sight from the small shapes of distance to the specific shapes of aircraft that are real and present, and getting larger at a rate that required the calculations of deflection shooting, the calculations that James performed without performing them, the way the scan happened alongside the other things, the calculations running in the hands and the eyes rather than in the reasoning mind. He fired at 8:44. The Browning guns in the wings produced the sound and vibration that 8 Brownings produced when they fired simultaneously. A sound that had nothing of the sound of guns in it, and everything of the sound of something tearing at very high speed. And the tracer showed him the relationship between where the rounds were going and where the Heinkel was going. And he adjusted. And the adjustment was the kind of adjustment that 11 months had made available, not calculated but felt, the feel of a man who has been doing a thing long enough that the thing has become a form of perception rather than a form of reasoning. The Heinkel he was firing at began to smoke from the port engine. The smoke was black and thick, and the kind that told him something specific about the port engine that the port engine would not recover from. He did not watch the Heinkel to see what the smoke resolved into, because watching was not available in the current situation, which had developed in the 2 seconds of the firing into a situation that required looking in directions other than the one he had been looking in. A 109 had come through the escort engagement and was behind him. He knew it before he saw it, knew it from the specific quality of the tracer that appeared at his left and slightly above, the tracer that told him the position of the aircraft that had produced it, the way the smoke had told him about the port engine of the Heinkel, through the information that the evidence contained, rather than through the reasoning about the evidence. He broke left and down, the Spitfire responding to the brake with the responsiveness that the Spitfire was designed for and that the Bf-109, which was a very good aircraft, could not match in the specific geometry of a hard left brake at this altitude. The difference between the two aircraft being not in speed or firepower, but in the rate of turn that the turn required, and that the Spitfire could produce and sustain. The 109 overshot. He watched it go past and above, and identified the pilot's response to the overshoot, which was a roll right and a climb to regain the altitude the attack had cost, which was the response that the situation produced, and that told him what he needed to know about where the 109 would be in the next 3 seconds. He pulled the nose up and turned into the climb, and the 109 was at close range when the gun sight found it, and he fired again, the second burst shorter than the first, because the geometry of the current position did not offer the time that the first burst had offered. And the 109 rolled, and the roll became something other than a controlled roll, the kind of roll that an aircraft produces when the aircraft's relationship with the pilot's intentions has been interrupted. He did not watch this resolution either. The sky above Biggin Hill at 8:46 on the morning of September 11th, 1940, was not a sky in which watching resolutions was something that the available attention could be allocated to. It was a sky with 12 aircraft from 92 Squadron and 40-plus Heinkels, and their escort and whatever other RAF squadrons had been vectored to the same intercept. A sky that was full in the specific way of a sky during the Battle of Britain, full of aircraft and the evidence of what the aircraft were doing, and the continuous production of new situations that each required the full attention that the previous situation had been consuming. James fought for 14 more minutes. The 14 minutes produced 3 more firing passes, 2 at bombers, and 1 at a second 109 that he hit, and that left the engagement in a direction that suggested it was not continuing to its intended destination. He was hit once himself, a round through the rear fuselage that produced a sound and a vibration that told him something had changed about the aircraft's relationship with its own structure, the relationship being less complete than it had been before the round, and the incompleteness being something he could feel in the controls the way he felt the engine through the airframe. The aircraft was flying. The controls were responding. The relationship was changed, but not ended. At 9 o'clock, the engagement broke. The Heinkel formation had been disrupted, the specific coherent shape of the formation converted by the engagement into the less coherent shape of a formation that has been worked on by the aircraft that had been sent to work on it. Some of the Heinkels continued toward London. Some turned back. The escort had been occupied with the squadrons that had been sent to occupy them, and the occupation had cost both sides what occupations cost, which is what is available to be spent in the service of the occupation. James reformed with the survivors of Blue Section at 9:04 and headed back to Biggin Hill. There were 4 aircraft where there had been 6. He did not count to confirm this. He knew it the way he knew things about the sky, through the awareness that the sky produced in him after 11 months, the awareness that registered the presence and absence of aircraft in his vicinity, without requiring the counting to register them. The damage to the rear fuselage produced a quality of response in the controls that required more attention on the approach than approaches usually required, the attention compensating for what the damage had taken from the aircraft's inclination to respond in the standard way to the standard inputs. He flew the approach with the specific focus of a man who knows the thing he is flying and is reading its current condition through the controls and adjusting for what the reading tells him, the adjustment being the skill of 11 months applied to a situation that 11 months of normal approaches had not produced. The skill available precisely because it lived in the hands and not in the reasoning that would have been too slow for the rate at which the aircraft was communicating its condition. He landed at 9:17. The ground crew was around the aircraft before the engine had fully stopped. The specific organized attention of men who have been doing this work since the battle began, and who read the condition of a returning aircraft the way James read the condition of the sky, through the accumulated information of months of looking at the thing they were looking at. One of them looked at the hole in the rear fuselage and said something to the man beside him that James did not hear, because he was taking off his helmet, and the helmet produced a specific muffling that the September air replaced with the smell of the airfield, the fuel and the oil and the wet grass, the smell that was the smell of the place he had left at 8:27 and had returned to at 9:17, 50 minutes that the clock recorded and that the body recorded differently. Wiersbicky was already out of his aircraft and standing on the perimeter track. He looked at James climbing down from the cockpit and looked at the rear fuselage and said, in the way he said things, "You were lucky with that one." James looked at the hole. He said, "The aircraft was lucky. The aircraft held." Wiersbicky said, "Same thing." James said, "Not quite." Wiersbicky looked at him with the expression he had when he was deciding whether to press a point, and decided not to press it, which was the decision he usually arrived at because he understood that some distinctions mattered to the person making them, in a way that pressing did not serve. Davies had not come back. This was the information that the count of returning aircraft had already told James, and that the ground crew confirmed with the specific economy of men who deliver this information often enough that the delivery has developed its own form. The form that is neither cold nor demonstrative, but is the form that the situation has produced through repetition. Davies had been in the squadron for 3 weeks. He had eaten breakfast that morning with the appetite of a young man who had not yet learned to eat carefully before flying. James wrote the combat report in the intelligence officer's office at 9:45, the report that converted the 50 minutes into the language that the report was for, the language of vectors and altitudes and firing passes and observed results and aircraft states. He wrote it with the efficiency of a man who has written many reports and who understands that the report's purpose is the information it contains rather than the experience it derives the information from, the experience being something that the report's language does not have a form for and was not designed to have a form for. The intelligence officer, a man named Harris, who had been a solicitor in civilian life and who brought to the extraction of combat information the specific patience of a man trained to extract information from people who are not always certain what they know, asked his questions, and James answered them. And Harris recorded the answers with the accuracy that Harris brought to everything, which was the accuracy of a man for whom inaccuracy in records was a category of failure that he had no tolerance for, regardless of the conditions under which the records were being made. Harris said, when the report was complete, 2 confirmed, 1 probable. James said, the second one, 09, may have been a confirmed. Harris said, we will see what the other reports say. He looked at his notes. You had a round through the rear fuselage. James said, the aircraft held. Harris looked at him and said, yes. He said it in the tone of a man who has heard this said before and understands what the saying means, which is not a statement about the aircraft, but a statement about the pilot's relationship to the aircraft and to what the aircraft's holding meant for the outcome of the morning, the outcome being James sitting in the chair across the desk, rather than being a line in the operations record, in the category of the record that Davies was now in. The second scramble came at 2:14 in the afternoon. James had eaten lunch and slept for 40 minutes in the chair in the readiness room, the specific sleep of a pilot between sorties that is not the sleep of recovery, but the sleep of maintenance, the minimum that the body requires to continue functioning, at the level the afternoon would require it to function at. He woke when the telephone rang with the completeness of a man who sleeps lightly between scrambles, because sleeping lightly is what the situation requires, and the body adapts to requirements. when the requirements are consistent enough and serious enough. The afternoon scramble was different from the morning scramble in the way that the afternoon raids during the Battle of Britain were different from the morning raids, which was that they were larger. The Luftwaffe had been sending large formations in the morning and larger formations in the afternoon through September. The logic being the logic of an operation that believes pressure and volume will produce the result that pressure and volume are being applied to produce, the result being the neutralization of the RAF's ability to respond, which would make the other thing possible, the other thing being what the channel crossing required in terms of conditions that could not be established while the RAF was still responding. The formation the radar showed was estimated at 80-plus aircraft. The controller's voice said this with the specific neutrality of a voice that has been saying things like this for 2 months and has developed the neutrality through the repetition, not the neutrality of a man who does not understand what 80-plus aircraft means for the men being vectored toward them, but the neutrality of a man who understands it completely and has concluded that the understanding is not information that belongs in the communication. 92 Squadron was vectored south at Angels 18. They climbed through the afternoon sky with the sun behind them, which was the position that the position was for, the position that put the sun behind the attacking aircraft, and in front of the aircraft being attacked, the geometry of light being one of the geometries of the battle that the pilots had learned to use, the way they had learned to use the geometry of turn rates and altitude differentials, and the specific properties of the aircraft they flew and the aircraft they flew against. James saw the formation at 2:31. Heinkel, 100s and 11s again, with Dornier 17s mixed in the formation, in a way that suggested the afternoon's target was different from the morning's. The mix being information about the intended target, the way the type of escort and the altitude of the formation were information about the intended target, and the information that the formation's composition suggested was the docks. The docks being what the formations with this mix at this altitude had been going for in the previous weeks. The docks being part of the escalating logic of the battle's current phase. The attack went in at 2:34. James took his section down through the escort engagement that the top cover was managing and found the bomber formation at the altitude the bomber formation was at and began the work that the work was, which was the specific repeated engagement of the firing pass and the break and the reassessment and the next firing pass, the cycle that the geometry of the engagement produced and that the pilot managed with the skills that the skills were for. He was hit again at 2:41, this time in the wing. Not a structural hit, but a hit that affected the fuel system in the wing in the way that hits to fuel systems affect them, which is by producing a relationship between the fuel and the places the fuel was not designed to be. That the instruments registered, and that James registered through the instruments. At the same moment he registered through the smell, the specific smell of aviation fuel in the cockpit. That was different from the smell of aviation fuel on the airfield, and that told him something was happening that required a decision. The decision was, continue the engagement or return to base. The fuel system hit was in the wing tank. The instrument showed pressure dropping in a pattern that told him something about the rate of the drop and the time the rate implied, and what the time implied for the distance to Biggin Hill. He ran the arithmetic. Not consciously, not as a deliberate calculation, but in the way that the body of evidence became a conclusion through the accumulation of what he knew about the aircraft's fuel requirements, and the distance, and the rate and the pattern, the conclusion being that he had enough to get back if he went now, and the margin was not large. He made the decision at 2:43. He called his section leader and reported the fuel situation and his intention, and pulled out of the engagement heading northwest toward Biggin Hill, with the throttle set at the setting, that the fuel situation specified, rather than the setting that the situation he was leaving specified, the two settings being different, in the way that the two situations were different. He was at 8,000 feet over Kent when the engine changed. Not stopped, changed. The specific quality of the Merlin's sound and the vibration through the airframe shifted in the way that a change in fuel delivery shifts it. Not the catastrophic change of a sudden stop, but the gradual change of a system that is receiving less of what it requires and is adjusting to less of what it requires in the way that systems adjust, by producing less of what requires more. The throttle was where he had set it, and the engine was producing less than the throttle setting specified, which meant the fuel system problem had developed beyond the rate the instrument had suggested when he had run the arithmetic at 243. He looked at the altimeter. 8,000 feet. He looked at the ground below him. Kent, in September from 8,000 feet, was the specific view of Kent that he knew from the months of the same area, seen from altitude, the fields and the villages and the roads that the maps had been made from, and that he had looked at often enough that looking at them was looking at something familiar, rather than looking at something that required interpretation. He identified his position in the way that position identification happened for a pilot who knows the ground, through recognition rather than calculation. He was 7 miles from Biggin Hill. The engine was producing enough to maintain altitude but not to climb, which meant the 7 miles would require the 7 miles of altitude to be available at the rate, the glide ratio of a Spitfire with a failing engine specified, the glide ratio and the 7 miles and the 8,000 feet, producing an arithmetic that was simple and had a clear answer. He called Biggin Hill at 2:49 and reported his position and his situation in the format that distress calls used, which was the format that converted the situation into the information that the information was for, the information being what Biggin Hill needed to prepare for the possibility that James was going to land somewhere other than the runway in the standard way. The controller acknowledged and vectored him to the nearest field, and James looked at the vector and looked at the ground and identified the field the controller was identifying and confirmed that the field and the arithmetic agreed, that the 8,000 feet and the 7 miles and the glide ratio and the field at the end of the vector were a set of numbers that produced the same conclusion from all the angles he looked at them from. The engine stopped at 254. Not gradually and then completely, but completely, with the specific finality of a thing that has been heading toward stopping and has arrived at stopping and is now stopped. The vibration through the airframe going still, and the sound going still, and the specific silence of a Spitfire, without its engine being the silence that replaced both. The propeller windmilled in the airflow, turning without producing anything. And the aircraft was now a very sophisticated glider, in the specific sense that a Spitfire with a stopped engine is a glider with the glide characteristics of a Spitfire rather than the glide characteristics of something designed to glide, which is a meaningful distinction at 2,000 feet over Kent. He flew the dead aircraft with the hands that had been flying it for 11 months, the hands that knew the aircraft's responses and were now learning what the aircraft's responses were without the engine that the responses had been calibrated to include, the learning happening in real time at the rate that real time required, each adjustment producing information about the next adjustment and the next adjustment, producing information about the one after it. The field was visible below and ahead, a large flat field that September had left, with a surface that the surface suggested was firm enough for the purpose being putting a Spitfire on it, in a way that preserved the Spitfire and the pilot to the maximum degree that the circumstances permitted. He put the aircraft down at 3:01. The landing was not the landing that runways produced. It was the landing that a large flat field in Kent produced, when a Spitfire without an engine met it at the speed and angle that the arithmetic of the approach had specified. The specific, hard meeting of the aircraft and the ground that was not the smooth, managed contact of a standard landing, but was the contact of a situation in which the standard had been replaced by the available, and the available was being used completely. The aircraft ran across the field and slowed and stopped with both wings intact, and the fuselage intact, and the cockpit intact, and James inside it. He sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds after the aircraft stopped. Not from any difficulty, but from the specific moment that follows the resolution of a situation that has been requiring everything for the previous 8 minutes. The moment that arrives when the requiring is over, and the body is still in the state the requiring produced, and the state has not yet received the information that the requiring is over. He looked at the field, and at the September sky above it, and at the stopped propeller in front of him, and at the instrument panel that was showing him the information about a stopped aircraft that instrument panels show. Then he unstrapped and climbed out and stood beside the aircraft on the grass of the Kent field, and looked at the wing where the fuel system hit had been, and saw what the hit had done to the fuel system with the specific clarity of a man looking at something from the outside after having been inside it, the outside view providing information the inside view did not provide. The hit had been in the wing root, close to the fuselage junction, in the location that the fuel lines ran through in the way that the Spitfire's fuel system ran through that location. The damage was specific and complete, and explained the arithmetic of 243 and the change at 244 and the stop at 254 with the clarity of a completed explanation. A farmer arrived at 3:09 in a vehicle that was not quite a truck and not quite a car, and that had the specific quality of a vehicle that has been doing farm work for many years and has been modified to do the work rather than replaced by something designed to do it. The farmer was a man of approximately 60, with the face of a man who has worked outside in England for 60 years, which is a specific kind of face that the English weather produces when given 60 years to produce it. He looked at James and looked at the Spitfire and said, "Are you all right?" James said, "Yes." The farmer said, "I saw you coming down." James said, "I was hoping you might." The farmer looked at the aircraft again with the expression of a man assessing something that has landed in his field and said, "I will need to inform someone." James said, "There will be people coming from Biggin Hill shortly." The farmer said, "Right then." He stood beside James, and they both looked at the aircraft in the way of two men standing beside something that has produced a situation and are waiting for the situation to develop its next phase. The recovery vehicle from Biggin Hill arrived at 3:47. The ground crew assessed the aircraft and confirmed what James had assessed from the outside, which was the damage and its location and its implications for the aircraft's near-term availability. The near-term being the period that the battle's requirements specified, and that the ground crew's repair capability was measured against. One of the ground crew, a man named Walsh, who had been working on Spitfires since before the battle, and who had developed the specific relationship with the aircraft that comes from sustained, intimate knowledge of a machine, looked at the wing route and said, 3 days. James said, 2, if you can manage it. Walsh said, 2.5, and I will be unhappy about the half. James said, 2.5 then. Walsh said, right. The truck from the airfield took James back to Biggin Hill. He arrived at 4:15 and went to the intelligence officer's office and wrote the second report of the day, the report that described the afternoon scramble and the engagement in the fuel system hit and the forced landing and the field in Kent, converting the afternoon's events into the language that the report was for, with the same efficiency he had brought to the morning report, the efficiency that came from the understanding that the report's purpose was the information, and that the information was what served the operation that continued after the report was written. Harris read the report while James sat across the desk. Harris said, "You nursed it 7 miles on a failing fuel system." James said, "The arithmetic worked out." Harris said, "The arithmetic and the flying." He looked at the report. One confirmed this afternoon, one probable. James said, "The probable was a confirmed, but I was not in a position to watch it." Harris said, "The other reports may confirm it." He set the report down. "You have had a long day." James said, "It has been a day." Harris said, "Go and eat something and sleep." He ate at 5:30 in the mess with Wierzbicki, who had come back from the afternoon scramble with a bullet hole in the canopy that had passed through the canopy at the specific angle that bullet holes in canopies pass through when the geometry is such that the canopy and not the pilot is what the round encounters. Wierzbicki had looked at the hole and described it to James in the way he described things, which was with the precision that included what mattered and excluded what did not. He said, "It was close." James said, "How close?" Wierzbicki held up his thumb and forefinger approximately 2 inches apart. James looked at the 2 inches. Wierzbicki said, "2 inches is enough." James said, "Yes." They ate in the specific silence of men who have said what they needed to say, and for whom the silence that follows is not empty. After dinner, James walked to the edge of the airfield and stood where the perimeter track met the grass and looked at the sky that September was making over Kent. The evening sky that was the sky after the day and before the night. The specific quality of English September evening that the Shropshire hills had in common with the Kent hills, in the way that English September evenings had in common across the distances that the country contained. He thought about Davies, which he was doing more deliberately now than he had been doing it during the day when the day's requirements had managed the thinking. The deliberateness of a man choosing to acknowledge something, rather than letting the choosing be made by whether the circumstances permitted. Davies had been 21 years old. He had talked about Cardiff with the specific attachment of a man who has grown up in a place and has not yet been away from it long enough to have perspective on the attachment, which is the attachment that has not yet been modified by the distance that perspective requires. He had eaten breakfast that morning with the appetite of a young man who had not learned to eat carefully before flying. James stood on the perimeter track and looked at the sky and thought about Davies and thought about the 5 from earlier in the summer and thought about the specific arithmetic of the squadron over the months, the arithmetic that the operations board recorded and that the pilots carried in the way they carried other things, in the background rather than in the front, present rather than prominent, available when the day's requirements allowed it to be available and manageable, when the day's requirements required it to be manageable. He thought about Clun and the hills and the sheep on the land that had been in the family before anyone could trace it. He thought about the specific quality of September in the Shropshire hills and about the fact that September in Kent had something of it. Not the same thing, but something in the same direction. The same angle of the evening light and the same temperature at this hour and the same smell of the grass at the edge of the airfield that the dew was already beginning to return to. The dew that would be heavy again at 5:47 tomorrow morning, when the airfield would be the airfield and the day would be what September days over Kent were in 1940, which was the days that the battle was making. He walked back to the mess at 7:30 and found Wierzbicki reading in the chair by the window, reading with the specific concentration of a man who has decided that reading is what the evening is for and has allocated the evening to it completely. James sat in the chair across from him. Wierzbicki did not look up from the book. After a moment he said, "Davies." James said, "Yes." Wierzbicki turned a page. He said, "He was here 3 weeks." James said, "Yes." Wierzbicki said, "It is not enough time," James said. "No. Where's Bicky?" said. "It is the time there was." He turned another page. James looked at the window and at the sky that was darkening through it. At 9 o'clock, he went to his quarters and lay down on the bed with his clothes on the way he slept between sorties, the way the situation had taught him to sleep, the complete preparation for the next thing running alongside the attempt at the rest that the next thing would require. He was asleep in 4 minutes. The sleep was the sleep that the body required and the circumstances permitted, which was not the sleep of a man who has nothing to do tomorrow, but the sleep of a man who has what tomorrow has, and is sleeping in the specific way that the what allows. The morning would come with the dew and the fuel and the telephone and the Merlin catching and the sky over Kent, and he would be in it the way he had been in it for 11 months, with the hands that knew the aircraft and the eyes that knew the sky, and the things that the months had made available to him, that he had not had before the months, the specific knowledge of what the sky required and what it was possible to do in it, and what it cost, and what it made possible. The knowledge that was not in any manual and was not produced by any training, but was the knowledge that the days themselves produced, when the days were the days that the battle was making over England. In the autumn of 1940. He slept. The airfield was quiet in the specific way of an airfield between the day's operations and the next day's operations. Quiet in the way of a place that is resting rather than still. The difference being that rest implies what comes after it, and what came after it was the morning. And the morning was what it was. This story is a work of original fiction, inspired by the historical events of the Battle of Britain, 1940. Any resemblance to specific real persons is coincidental. The story is intended to honor the courage of the pilots and ground crews who served during this period. This video is made for educational and entertainment purposes. If this resonated with you, subscribe and leave a like. New video coming soon.